So in terms of how did the riot happen? The riot happened. The Rebbe's motorcade was coming back. The Rebbe would visit his father-in-law and his wife after she passed away, where they were buried in Queens. And on the way back, one of the cars that was behind was a group of yeshiva students who would help kind of set things up and to allow the Rebbe to come. They fell behind the Rebbe's car and the police escort that was leading them, and they crossed the intersection as the light was changing. When their car was hit by an oncoming car at the intersection, they went flying out of control. They tried to avoid a crowd. In the process, went on the sidewalk and hit two Guyanese children, first cousins, Gavin and Angela Cato. And tragically, Angela was wounded very severely, and Gavin ultimately ended up passing away from his wounds. The Hasidic driver in the car jumped out, tried to help them, was unable to, and in the process, a crowd gathered immediately. It was, a Brooklyn day where everyone was outside. The weather was pretty nice. People came over, and immediately the crowd became very aggressive. And there was this, perception that the Jews had somehow did it on purpose. Somebody called the paramedics, and someone also called Hatzalah, being the Jewish volunteer ambulance service, which was created in New York City. Now it's all over the world, as a way to help fill in the gaps when New York City infrastructure was down. So that when people were wounded or were hurt in general in New York, because it would take so long for an ambulance to come and the care you would get wouldn't be good, this allowed local volunteers who knew the neighborhood, knew the culture, could speak Yiddish, could speak to people, to come and help them out right away. So you had the cops came first, dispersed the crowd. Then Hatzalah came, the Jewish volunteer EMTs. The cops, seeing the situation going on in Crown Heights and how it was turning ugly, and then in fact there were people beating up the Hasidic driver, and then the situation just told the Jewish EMTs, you take your guys, the city's on their way within minutes anyway, in an attempt to try and defuse things. And in fact, the EMTs themselves had tried to work on the wounded children, but interesting how toxic it was and how violent it was getting, the cops said, just take the Jews and go. The optics of that did not look well to the crowd. So when people didn't see and understand this was an attempt by the police, by non-Jewish police officers, to try and defuse the situation, instead it was interpreted as the Jews only take care of the Jews and left the children to die. The city EMTs came very shortly after that. Unfortunately, they weren't able to help Gavin, who passed away. Later, after these events, the people stood out on the corner, non-Jews, and began to speak about, the Lubavitchers doing this and the Hasidic Jews doing that, and spreading all kinds of really conspiracy theories, if you think about the things they said, rumors that people were drunk, and all kinds of things that were just baseless. And the crowd got very angry. People ran to the neighborhood and began to, throw rocks at windows that had mezuzahs on it and beat up Jews they saw on the street. Jump forward to later that evening, and there was a student named Yankel Rosenbaum who was visiting from Australia. He was working on his doctoral thesis about actually anti-Semitism in interwar Poland and about the relevancy to the world today, which is kind of chilling if you think about the ramifications of what he was looking into. He had been studying in the YIVO archive in New York, and he was staying by family friends in Crown Heights. He was coming back to Brooklyn from being in a different neighborhood, and while he was walking on the street, he was accosted by a crowd of people. The numbers vary. It could have been 15 to 20, 30, different, but the whole group of people came over and began to beat him up, and ultimately someone took a knife and began to stab him. This really was kind of a group attack on him, and even though he was a strong, tall person, he was unable to fend off the entire crowd. He was hurt very badly. The police came, and they brought him to the hospital, where he passed away from his wounds later, early the next morning. And so, this just, kind of set the stage for really, really awful days. And that's why a lot of people in Crown Heights call what happened, the riot, the riot that came, from these events, they called it a pogrom, because you had this experience where you had non-Jews destroying Jewish homes, destroying Jewish property. The police, for whatever reason, this is kind of, you can look at the article that has a lot of back and forth about, various ways in which people understand what happened, but, at the very least, the police didn't act. They didn't step in, and they stood by. And so that caused, just this really, horrible, frightening experience where anti-Semitism happened. I think the relevance, to us is how we as a Jewish community can and should stick by each other, right? That's kind of the takeaway that I have today, because in America, sadly, some of the Jewish, main organizations didn't speak up right away, and eventually they understood what was going on, understood the horror what was happening. But because it was these Hasidic Jews, the Haredi, they're so not like us. Maybe something happened, and they were slow to act. And I think today there's a lesson that when something bad happens to any Jew, no matter who they are or what they look like, it needs to be important to each and every single one of us, because we really are in this together. And there was an opinion piece written by someone named Abe Rosenthal. He was a big journalist here in whatchamacallit, in America, the New York Times. And so he had, at that point in time, he had an opinion column, and he said, don't think that if you live, on the Upper East Side, which is kind of more posh Jewish community, maybe a little less, observant today. There's beautiful, Orthodox shuls and a lot going on there. Don't think that you can hide your Jewishness, so to speak. That, you may feel like that you and your wife look like a non-Jew, but to the non-Jew, you look as Jewish as the Hasidic guy. And that, we really do have to stick together, because if we don't, then what happens to one of us could happen to any of us.